Hi, my name is Marcus.
And I'm Andreas.
And we are porting programmers from QLock in Warsaw. We are here today to talk about our experience with checkerboard rendering in Dark Souls Remastered. Some of our slides are a bit code heavy. We don't expect you to remember it all by heart. Our slides will be published hopefully later today. I'm not sure if I can make that promise, but hopefully later today. When the slides are published, we will probably post a link on our Twitter. You can see our Twitter handle on the screen right now. So, today we're going to briefly talk about the history of checkerboard rendering, the theory behind how it works. We will take a peek into how it integrates with the rendering pipeline of Dark Souls Remastered, and we will look at the results we got from using it. Before we talk about checkerboarding, we have to introduce a similar concept. Interlacing. Interlacing has a long and complicated history in movies and television. It was used to reduce transmission bandwidth by only sending every second row of a full image. Killzone Shadowfall uses interlacing to reduce the number of pixels rendered in a frame. A full frame is then reconstructed in software before being presented to the user. Checkerboard rendering further improves upon this concept by using a more optimal sample distribution. Each missing point in the checkerboard pattern has knowledge of 4 neighbors instead of only 2 neighboring pixels with interlacing. Checkerboard rendering is used in plenty of recent games, including Rainbow Six Siege, Battlefield 1, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Dark Souls Remastered. The reason we decided to try checkerboard rendering in DSR is that we knew that we needed a rather big performance boost to achieve high resolution in 60 FPS. We estimated that we could run the game in 1440p without checkerboarding, but that anything higher would be difficult. So the question is, how do you do it? We have to start with some theory. Our goal with checkerboard rendering is to shade only half of the pixels of a final frame. By alternating the checkerboard pattern each frame, like you can see on the slide, there should theoretically be enough information to produce a full image at half of the shading cost. But here is a more realistic example. There's been quite a lot of research into how to do this. One of the simplest ways is to simply stencil out every second pixel. Sadly, there's no performance gain from this because the GPU shades in 2x2 tiles, so you effectively throw away half of the work. You could try stenciling out pixel quads in checkerboard pattern instead, but there just isn't enough information to reconstruct the missing quads, so the image would look blurrier. Instead, we chose to go with checkerboard rendering, which we will now describe in detail. In order to produce the checkerboard pattern you saw earlier, we need to change the sample locations. Luckily, both the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X have support for programmable sample locations. This is just a function call away on either platform. The sample locations are specified as offsets from the pixel center in 1/16ths of a pixel. The image here shows the sample pattern we used in DSR. Note that we don't show the vertical sample offset in this presentation because we always set it to 0. Both of the APIs we use have support for specifying a unique sample pattern for each pixel within a pixel quad. The pattern you specify will be repeated across the whole render target. If we flip the bottom row sample positions horizontally, you can see that the checkerboard pattern starts to emerge. The green dots here are sample 0, and the black dots are sample 1. On the right, you can see the sample offsets represented as values as well. The sample locations are also flipped every other frame to produce the alternating checkerboard pattern. On the screen, you can see the patterns produced on even and odd frames. It is very important that they are not flipped mid-frame, as that would result in different passes sampling from different positions, leading to corruption. Now that the sample locations are set, the square pixels to the left produce an uneven sampling distribution. You can see that the sample locations are closer to each other horizontally than vertically. To make the sample distribution uniform, the pixels have to be twice as wide as they are tall, as pictured to the right. For this reason, all checkerboarded render targets have to be created at half of the width of the desired resolution. In Dark Souls Remastered, the depth prepass is the first thing we render in the main view. We use a depth prepass because we use forward shading, and we want to avoid as much overdraw as possible. This is a picture of our depth buffer taken in Anolondo. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the flow of the frame. We will show this again as new passes are introduced. At the same time as we write depth, we also write something called object and triangle IDs. These are required in the checkerboard resolve pass, but we will go into more details on exactly how they're used later. We need to have ID information for every final pixel, even those we don't render color to. Since render target is half width, as we already established, the easiest way for us to render samples for each native resolution pixel is to set the render target to 2 times MSAA. There's an extra benefit to this, which we will get back to shortly. Object and triangle IDs are 16-bit integers packed into a 32-bit uint render target. The picture to the left is a visualization of the object IDs, while the picture to the right also displays triangle IDs. As you can see, every object has a unique object ID, and every triangle with an object has a unique triangle ID. To determine the object ID of a mesh, we simply use the lower 16 bits of the index buffer pointer. In our case, the models, especially the map elements, are batched into larger objects. This results in the same object ID being used for things that probably should have distinct object IDs, which some of you might have noticed in the image to the left. However, we never noticed any major drawbacks from this, so we just never split them up. The object and triangle IDs can be written automatically by hardware on PS4 Pro by just calling a couple of functions. On Xbox One X, we use a custom shader to generate and write these IDs, since they sadly don't have it in hardware. And this is what that shader looks like. The global object ID is sent via a constant buffer, and to get the triangle IDs, we simply hash the 3 vertex IDs that make up the triangle, and we pack it along with the object ID into our 32-bit uint. The next thing we do is called an EQAA depth resolve. Since only one of the samples is shaded when rendering color, it would be a waste of bandwidth to use a depth buffer with 2 samples. Therefore, we can perform a single sample depth resolve, which copies only the first sample of each pixel to another depth buffer. Using this instead of the original double sample depth buffer in later passes significantly reduces bandwidth. The PS4 has a nice helper function for doing this, which also happens to be blazing fast. On Xbox, since we use DirectX 11, we once again have to use a custom shader to accomplish this. However, if you use DirectX 12, there is a really nice function for it. And here's the custom pixel shader we use on Xbox One X. The load function on multi-sample textures lets you specify which sample to load, so we just tell it to select the first one, and we immediately output that. All you have to do is draw a full screen quad. It's that simple. On PS4, we use something called H-tile acceleration. Some of you might not be familiar with H-tiles, so let me quickly explain how they work to make the next part way less confusing. H-tiles is a technique used to optimize depth testing. It is a buffer with one 32-bit uint per 8x8 tile in the depth render target. In these 32 bits, we store 4 bits called the Z mask, 14 bits for max Z, and 14 bits for min Z. The H-tile simply acts like a bounding box for those 8x8 pixels of depth values, specifying the local min and max. The GPU can then use this buffer while depth testing to potentially cull away 64 pixels at once for testing each individual pixel. Now, how is this relevant for us? Well, the H-tile generated while rendering the depth prepass does not automatically carry over while copying the depth values. So if you want to use H-tile acceleration for the single sample depth buffer, you can reuse the double sample depth buffer's H-tile using this compute shader. You just have to mark the Z mask as expanded, which we do with the 0xF flag. This tells the GPU that the tile is uncompressed. And here's what the depth resolve looks like. To the left is our double sample depth buffer, and to the right is our single sample depth buffer. Since we only pick sample 0, which is offset in the other direction every second row, this results in some pretty interesting edges. This is intended though, and we will cover that later.
All right. The next thing we render is the color pass. In Dark Souls Remastered, we use a clustered forward shading technique. We experiment with various methods like deferred rendering, but settled on the one that closest matched the original pipeline for parity reasons. The color pass renders to a half-width, single-sample render target. We also set the same sample locations as the depth pre-pass, and because of this, we can use the resolved buffer from the previous pass, and depth testing will work as intended. The texture gradients calculated by the GPU will be incorrect due to the way our samples are positioned, as you can see in the image to the left. Using the incorrect texture gradients when sampling from textures will cause the hardware to select higher MIP levels than preferable. Therefore, they need to be adjusted. This can be done in hardware on the PS4 Pro with a simple function call. On Xbox One X, this has to be done manually in shaders. This is the formula we used for adjusting the texture gradients. On the PS4 Pro, the factors in green are stored in the texture units and can be set with the set texture gradient factors function. The texture units have special functionality for applying this transform without any performance overhead. And here you can see the factors we use for adjusting the gradients on even and odd frames. This is a picture of the resolved frame with the gradient adjust disabled. And this is the same picture with the gradients adjusted. Much better. Usually, vertex parameters are interpolated using the pixel center as a reference point, represented by the black dots in this picture. This basically means that if the camera is static, a triangle's text chords, for example, will remain the same, even though the sample locations are moving. This is pretty bad for image quality. Luckily, there's a keyword in HLSL called sample that fixes this. Placing the keyword in front of a vertex parameter will interpolate it using the sample position, shown in green, instead of the pixel center. Using the sample keyword will also force the pixel shader to execute per sample instead of per pixel, but this is fine, however, because our render target only has one sample anyway, so the pixel shader is only invoked once. Here's a picture of the resolved frame with barycentric valuation at the pixel center, and this window looks extra bad because the decorations in the foreground are alpha tested. And here's the same picture with barycentrics evaluated at the sample position. A lot better. At this point, if you open the frame in a graphics debugger, your render target should look something like the image to the left. This is because only one of the samples in the checkerboard pattern is shaded, and the texture contains no data for the other sample. If we substitute the missing samples for some placeholder color, you can see that it looks correct. In the graphics debugger for PS4, this substitution is available as a filter and can be very useful for verifying that the checkerboard pattern is correct. In the last part of the color pass, we draw special effects, like this fire from the Hellkite Dragon. In Dark Souls Remastered, some special effects are rendered to a dynamically sized render target. If the effect pass takes too long to render at full resolution, the game switches the pass into half resolution. Half resolution in the checkerboarded case means half the resolution of the already checkerboarded target, so it maintains the same aspect ratio. If we render to the half resolution target, it has to be combined back into the main color target afterwards. We do this by rendering a full screen quad. In the pixel shader, we use the screen space location to sample from the downscale texture and output the result. The two rectangles to the left represent 2 pixels from the half resolution target. The smaller black dots represent where the pixel shader would normally be invoked. As you can see, this completely ignores the checkerboard sample locations of our main color target. But if we place the sample keyword on the parameter that we use for sampling and change the sample locations from code, we can get the shader to sample from the green dots instead, which produces correct results. And here's what the checkerboarded color looks like after upscaling the effects. Even though the pixel center might look better in this context, keep in mind that this image shows the checkerboarded color and not the color of any resolved frame. The next thing we render is a velocity map. To the left, you can see a picture of the velocity map taken in Sense Funhouse. The velocity map is also a half-width single sample render target, just like the color. In this pass, we use the same sample locations as the color pass, so depth testing once again will work as intended. The velocity map contains per pixel UV space velocities stored as 16-bit floats. This means that if an object were to move from the very left side of the screen to the right in a single frame, the velocity would be 1. And the same goes for top to bottom. In Dark Souls Remastered, not all objects are rendered to the velocity map, however. That's why some parts of this image is yellow. We have to account for this when reading from it later on. The velocity map is clear to 1 before rendering, so checking this is trivial. If a specific pixel doesn't contain velocity information, it has to be calculated on demand by using the current scene depth and camera movement. In our case, this turned out to be pretty expensive, since passes that need the per pixel velocities now have to read from the depth buffer as well. It would have been better to resolve all velocities in a full screen pass instead, right after the velocity pass. In Dark Souls Remastered, we perform some post-processing on the checkerboarded color target before the full frame is reconstructed. The first filter we apply is separable subsurface scattering. We apply this on character's skin and some vegetation in the game. Next up is bloom. Be sure to check how your engine calculates the Gaussian blur offsets. As it often relies upon the aspect ratio of the render target, the blur may be stretched horizontally. Luminosity estimation works well with the checkerboarded color, since total brightness doesn't vary much from after the frame has been reconstructed. It's also just an estimation, so it doesn't have to be very accurate. And finally, we use the same tone mapping technique as Uncharted 2. We did nothing special to account for the checkerboard, since it's performed on a per pixel basis. The next pass is the checkerboard resolve. This is where the magic happens. In this pass, we resolve a native resolution image, using the partial color we rendered this frame. Our implementation of checkerboard rendering is based off the reference implementation provided by Sony, with some improvements. The resolve shader is divided into 2 parts, the spatial component and the temporal component. The spatial component resolves the color of the missing samples using clever blending. The temporal component then stabilizes the image using information from the previous frame. So, let's imagine for a second that we're writing the spatial resolve from scratch. What's the most simple thing we could do? We could take the average of all neighbors. Before I even show you how that looks, we can add one more trivial improvement. We can use the full resolution IDs written in the depth prepass. Using these IDs, we can determine which neighbors belong to the same triangle as the missing sample. We can then limit the averaging function to only account for those. And here you can see the difference between the two. As you can see, this really helps define the edges between objects a lot better. But here's a scene where it doesn't look as good. This is because the ID check only improves the cases where the missing sample lies near an edge. Inside triangle boundaries, we're still using the simple averaging function. So how can we improve this? Let's resolve the missing pixels by hand. These scenarios are taken from the same image you just saw, and let's assume that all pixels belong to the same triangle, so we only have the color to work with. How can we make better guesses than a simple averaging function? From looking at the first example, my intuition tells me that the missing pixel should probably be green, creating a horizontal edge. By the same logic, the pixel in the second example should probably be black, creating a vertical edge. And this last one is a bit tricky. It might be a vertical black line, it might also be a horizontal green line. And both cases seem equally plausible, so we could do something like this. It might not be correct, but it's the best guess we can do. We obviously have some idea about how the missing samples should be resolved, but how can we turn this intuition into code? The answer is called differential blending. If the colors in one direction are more similar, they will represent more of the final color. This will produce similar results to the ones we just came up with ourselves. If the neighbors on opposite sides of the missing sample do not belong to the same object, a constant weight is used. The resolve is still just an average, but now it's weighted in either direction. And here you can see the difference between the simple average and the differential blending. Much better. Let's see how our new resolve behaves in this example scene. Please note that this is a very unrealistic example. For this pixel, all neighbors belong to the same triangle, so all 4 will be used for blending, producing this purple color. How about this pixel? Here, all neighbors except for the south one belong to the same triangle. This makes the resulting color a blend between 2 red and 1 blue sample, resulting in a more red-purple color. This last missing pixel gets blended between 2 blue samples and 1 red sample, giving it a more blue tint. Because we strictly follow the rule of matching triangle IDs, this will give us a false hard edge along this object, even though the rendered color on either side wouldn't produce that edge. So the problem is that we sometimes want contribution from neighbors who are not necessarily inside the same triangle as the missing sample. This can be resolved by constructing a color bounding box of all neighbors within that triangle, and then testing whether the remaining samples are contained within that bounding box. And just to clarify, this is a bounding box of the neighbors' colors rather than their coordinates. Using this technique in the previous example would solve the problem with false hard edges. The blue sample to the south now gets accepted because the blue sample to the north was included in the color bounding box. Here you can see the difference that the color bounding box makes. To be perfectly honest, this doesn't change a whole lot, at least not in the scenes we checked. Depending on your content, you might see better results. Since we're using the triangle IDs to identify distinct surfaces, highly tessellated areas can cause problems. This image contains a lot of places where the missing sample only has 1 neighbor to fetch color from. This will cause the missing sample to directly copy the color of that single neighbor. We can resolve this special case by falling back to the object IDs instead, applying the differential blend operator on a larger number of samples. Here's what the final spatial component looks like when applied to the checkerboarded color. That's a pretty good guess. The spatial resolve isn't perfect though. This scene contains a lot of places where the differential blend operator is failing to identify the correct color. The result is also different depending on which sample is shaded, as you can see here. What we really want is a combination of these 2 frames. This is where the temporal component comes in. It improves the image quality by enhancing the guesses made by the spatial resolve with data from the previous frame. The temporal component works by reprojecting the color of the previous frame's checkerboard resolve output. The previous color is also clamped between the local min and max values around the current sample. The previous color is then blended with the current color by some constant factor. In Dark Souls Remastered, this constant factor is 0.6, meaning that 60% of the previous frame is used, the previous color is used. In order to get accurate velocity information from the checkerboarded velocity map, we sample 4 velocities within a 3x3 area around the sample and compute the average. To the right, you can see the resulting patterns: a cross shape for the pass-through sample and a plus shape for the resolved sample. Here's what the temporal component looks like when applied to the spatial result. One issue we found with the temporal resolve was ghosting behind characters when moving the camera. You can see to the left of the character here. Because even though the previous color is clamped to somewhat match the current color, the local color difference can still be too large, like the specular highlights in this scene. My first idea was to do something similar to the anti-ghosting in Uncharted 4, where a stencil is used to distinguish objects. But then I realized, by saving the object and triangle IDs from the previous frame, we can check if a surface has been disoccluded by comparing the previous and current object IDs. If a pixel has been disoccluded, we skip the temporal component and only use the spatial result. This image shows the areas where the current and previous object IDs do not match. In our case, this works well because we don't perform any temporal anti-aliasing, so dilating the IDs is not needed. And here you can see the difference again. After the resolve, we perform some additional post-processing. We applied these filters here because we found that it didn't produce acceptable results when applied to the checkerboarded color. Depth of field and motion blur propagates color across object edges, which makes it difficult to know which color belongs to which object. In order to run the depth of field at native resolution, we give it a double sample depth buffer, since it contains depth information for all pixels in the resolved image. The motion blur, however, uses a checkerboarded velocity and depth buffers. This works because our motion blur compacts the velocities into larger tiles anyway, so a native per pixel velocity map is not really needed.
All right, let's talk about some results. For comparing quality and performance, we decided to take our captures in a quiet spot in Orlando. Our reasoning behind this is that we needed some interesting geometry, which we will get from the windows, but we also don't want a lot of dynamic objects and particles with randomness that makes comparing performance difficult. Please note, though, that this spot is not very performance intensive, so we still have to reserve a bit of the frame time budget for particles, more characters, and multiplayer. All frame times are taken on PS4 Pro. So let's start off by looking at 1080p. This is standard 1080p without checkerboarding. It's not very interesting to look at, and there isn't a lot to add. This runs extremely fast on the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, showing that they are overpowered for this task, which is why we aim for high resolution on those platforms to begin with. This is the resolution we run on regular PS4 and Xbox One. Here we have 1080p with checkerboarding. Because 1080p has bigger pixels, it means that we have less data during the checkerboard resolve. So compared to high resolutions, we get a bigger loss of quality. This also only saves 0.6 milliseconds, stemming from the fact that the shading rate is not the bottleneck at this resolution. All in all, I would not recommend using checkerboard rendering in 1080p. It is only included here to compare results. But yeah, here you can see the difference between them. Okay, this is standard 1800p without checkerboarding. It has way better quality compared to 1080p, as can easily be seen in the window details and the diagonal edge of the support beam. It isn't quite 2160p, but I can see why some games use this resolution as a halfway point between 1080p and 2160p. I would also like to point out that while this capture is way below our 16.6 milliseconds target frame time, This is not the case everywhere. When you start adding a lot of particles, enemies, and more characters, it is pretty much on the edge of stable 60 FPS with frequent dips. This is despite the fact that we did quite a lot of conventional optimizing work during the project. Here we have 1800p with checkerboarding. Compared to regular 1800p, it looks pretty good. We lose some specular highlights and texture details of the window, but it still mostly looks like regular 1800p, especially the edges. With checkerboarding, we save 2.6 milliseconds, which firmly pushes us under our target frame rate, even with a lot of particles and in multiplayer. This is the resolution we decided to use on both PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and it gives us a very stable 60 FPS. Here you can see the difference again. Okay, and this is 2160p, or 4K if you prefer that, without checkerboarding. It is the golden standard of this generation. It looks great, it has a lot of details, and the edges are very crisp. Sadly, if you look at the frame times, this proves to be too much, even in this simple scene. For us, 2160p without checkerboarding is completely out of the question. And lastly, here's 2160p with checkerboarding. As you can see, we once again lose some specular highlights and texture details, but it still mostly looks like 2160p. This scene is stable 60 FPS, but this is not the case in heavier scenes. With additional optimization, we might have been able to make this stable everywhere. All in all, it saves around 3.4 milliseconds. One more time, here you can see the difference. And yeah, here's one last quality comparison between 1080p on the left, which we use in the base consoles, and 1800p on the right, which we use in Pro consoles. 1800p with checkerboarding, of course. I don't know about you guys, but I prefer the one on the right. Here we have a summary of the performance measured in the different resolutions. 1080p sees 13% better performance while checkerboarding, but at a considerable quality loss. 1800p runs 27% faster with checkerboarding at a way smaller quality loss. 2160p runs 25% faster with checkerboarding, also with a low amount of quality loss. We're almost done with this presentation, so here are some takeaways. This optimizes shading rate and bandwidth. If that is not the bottleneck, you won't see large improvements. This optimization scales with how complex your pixel shaders are. Ours are actually pretty simple, so you might actually see better results. There also seems to be some kind of diminishing returns in play here. And this is a very powerful optimization tool, but it has some drawbacks. You will have to decide if the slight quality loss is worth it for you. Run native resolution if you can afford it, but if I had to pick between a lower native resolution or a higher checkerboard resolution, I would pick checkerboarding every time. The very last thing I want to briefly discuss is what we can improve in the future. One rather obvious improvement, which we sadly didn't have time for during development, is to apply a simple sharpness filter to bring back some of the details that got blurred during the resolve step. And since the release of Dark Souls Remastered, we have also experimented with using LDS to optimize the color sampling in the resolve shader. This saw minor speed-ups, but we still need to spend some more time profiling it before it's ready. We would have greatly benefited from using dynamic resolution, which would allow for some quieter scenes to reach 2160p without sacrificing frame rates. Dynamic resolution is supposed to work really well with checkerboard rendering, but we didn't have enough time to investigate it. We are also interested in methods of doing checkerboard rendering on platforms that don't have explicit control over sample locations, like on PC. We could use certain API extensions to be able to set them explicitly, but that's usually only available on relatively new cards. We would like to find a solution that would work everywhere. Intel has a really clever solution to this. So let's start off by looking at the regular 2x MSAA sample positions in the image to the left. This grid looks just like the one we have for our even frames. It turns out that if we offset this grid one sample width to the right, which you can see in the middle picture, we get the sample position for the odd frames. This means that we can simply use the regular 2 times MSAA sample positions together with a slight camera offset to get the same result on hardware that doesn't support explicit sample locations. The main issue with this is that we don't get native resolution object IDs unless we decide to run the whole depth repass in native resolution, which would make reconstruction a bit more guesswork. We are currently recruiting for these positions. Please ask QLOC people for more information, or you can join us via our website. Do we have any questions? No? I'm going to take that as a good thing.
So thank you.